Bright Duty. Every student matters.
Hello everyone. In today's class, we will look at chapter 11 in your book, which is titled Confrontation of Cultures, and the time period which is of focus will be 15th to 18th century. So as the name itself suggests, the word confrontation refers to encounter or coming face to face with something. So here, what is coming face to face or encountering each other is culture of two different continents, that is Europe and America. So when Europeans come in contact with Native Americans, what happens and why it is considered as an important event in the world history. So this is what our focus will be, and the time period in which it happens is beginning from 15th century and it continues for a long period, that is till the 18th centuries. So here our focus will be on first the factors which are leading to this confrontation, that is the factors which are responsible for the Europeans to reach or discover places like America. What are the historical factors which are laying the foundations of such a discovery? And then we see the course of this interaction or the confrontation taking place. How it happens over the period. And then, as in most important, is the consequences of this confrontation. What happens as a result of this coming together or encounter of two cultures? Who gain and who lose? And how it is an important chapter in the world history. So here we begin our journey towards understanding these crucial historical happenings to better our knowledge of world history and its making. So as introduction, we have already seen that the encounter is between Europeans and the natives of Americas. So now when the Europeans reach America in the 15th century, they come into contact or they see the people who are natives or indigenous people of America. That is the locals who have belonged to this place for a long time. That is what natives or indigenous refers to. And obviously the time period is between 15th and 18th century in broad, but the main focus will be till 17th century. And some Europeans, particularly the Spanish and the Portuguese, undertook voyages to unknown oceans to discover trading routes where slaves and spices were available in abundance. So here this whole discovery of new continents and trade with them is started by Spanish and Portuguese, and it's only later that other European countries or nations follow this trend, which is started by nations like Spain and Portugal. So that's why it is important to know what Spain and Portugal initiates and what their incentives or what their interests were. So the major interest is to discover new trading routes which will provide them with slaves. So slaves, as you know, will give us cheap labor. So when you have a section of slaves to do your work, you don't have to pay them at all. They are forced to work for you. So that way a very cheap labor is what you're getting. And spices. So in Europe there is lack of spices or production of it because of the particular geographical conditions of that area. So the Europeans had to depend on these newly discovered places where they got to know that it is rich source of spices, and then the European markets had a huge demand for the spices by the 15th century. So that's why they take interest in discovering new places which could provide them with such materials. And they broke the narrow geographical bonds that had kept them in ignorance of much of the rest of the world. So, what is most important is for this exploration to take place, they break all the boundaries which confined the Europeans to themselves. So, now instead of confining themselves to their continent, they are opening out their borders or boundaries to discover new places and explore it. And they persuaded the Pope, we already know is the head of Catholic Church and who plays a major role in Europe. And we see states like Spain and Portuguese is persuading or making the Pope give them exclusive rights to rule over any new region they might discover. So, when the Pope gives them the right to rule over any place they discover, so it is legitimizing or giving legitimacy to a foreign rule. So, when they go and colonize or discover a new place, they go and establish their rule over that new place. And the justification or the excuse given is the Pope, who is the supreme head, who is the representative of God, has given them the permission to do so. So that's why they persuaded the Pope to give them the permission. And in 1492, Columbus, an Italian adventurer, sponsored by the ruler of Spain, sailed west to reach East Indies. And this is a most crucial year in the history of explorations, that in 1492, Columbus, one of the famous explorers and adventurer, sails to the East Indies, and he was sponsored by the ruler of Spain. But the lands he had reached were the West Indies. He had read in the travels of Italian adventurer Marco Polo about the East Indies. Columbus did not reach Asia, but he had discovered a new world, the America. So, although he wanted to reach East Indies, accidentally Columbus reaches the West Indies and uh, plays a major role in discovering till then unknown continent, which was Americas. And later explorations by Europeans indicated that the Indians of New World actually belonged to different cultural groups and were from no part of Asia. So initially Columbus thinks that he has discovered this place which has been referred to by the great traveler Marco Polo, but very soon he realizes that it was no part of Asia that he had come to. And they found two types of cultures in Americas. So these two types of cultures were, there were small subsistence economies in the Caribbean region and in Brazil. So in the Americas, you find that in the Caribbean region of the continent and in Brazil, there were small subsistence economy. That is, they cultivated small areas and they lived with whatever produce they were getting from that piece of land. And second, there were also powerful monarchical system of government. So here too, another culture was powerful monarchs or kings with an empire or a kingdom of their own. And it was based on well developed agriculture and mining. So these kingdoms were based on well developed agriculture and mining. Like the Aztecs and the Mayas of Central America, and the Incas of Peru, they also had monumental architecture. So some of these kingdoms were Aztecs and then Mayas of Central America and then Incas of Peru. These were all monarchical systems of government, and all these kingdoms had very magnificent monumental buildings and architecture. Now we see the impact of European settlement on South America. So when Europeans come in confrontation with Native Americans, we already saw there are two different types of dominant culture, one based on subsistence agriculture and the other which have strong, powerful kingdoms with a monarchical head. So the explorations and later the colonization of South America had disastrous consequences for the native people and their culture. So what we see is first they explore new places and they colonize or establish their control over these new places. So because of this colonization process, it had disastrous or very negative effect on the people of America. The story of slave trade also begins with Europeans selling slaves from Africa to work in plantations and mines in Americas. So it also marks the beginning of a very brutal tradition in the world history, that is slave trade. Here humans are bought and sold as slaves to assist as cheap labor. So it is when after the exploration and colonization of the America that slave trade becomes very important, so that it would help the explorers gain more wealth and profit. So here the slaves were brought from Africa to work in plantations and mines in the Americas. And after conquering America, the European settlers ruthlessly destroyed the manuscripts and monuments of natives. So, along with the colonization, the conquerors or the colonizers destroyed the manuscripts. So, we know when the records are destroyed, it means the history of those people are erased off. Whatever they have noted down and recorded of their culture and their traditions are erased off from the history and from the memory of the people. And it was only in the last decades of the 19th century that the anthropologists started studying their cultures. And it was only long time after, that is from 15th to 19th century, it is more than 4 centuries, that it takes the anthropologists. So anthropologists are scholars who closely study different living cultures. So study of human culture is called anthropology. How people live, what their traditions are, what their beliefs, practices are, like marriage ceremonies, death ceremony. All of these things are closely studied to understand the values and beliefs of a set of people. So this study of human culture is what is called anthropology, and the scholar who does it is called the anthropologist. And it is only by 19th century that the anthropologists take interest in learning about these cultures which was there in America when the European colonizers had come to America. And it was till later that the archaeologists found the remains of their civilization. So, and it took a long time for the archaeologists to find the remains of the civilization, because by then all of this thing had declined and these cultures or civilization had become extinct. And human beings had been living in North and South American islands for thousands of years. So both in the North and the South American continents, the people had settled there for thousands of years before the coming of the colonizers. And many people from Asia and South Sea also gradually migrated to South America, which was densely forested and mountainous. So we also see that human history is a history of human migration, or it is not like people were always sedentary, but then people moved. The origin of human civilization is said to have happened in South Africa, and it is from there that people moved to different parts of the world. So, migration or moving or the mobility of people is a common human nature. And here too, the South America was populated by people who had come there from far off continents like Asia and other parts of the world. And the world's largest river, Amazon, flows through hundreds of miles of dense forest in South America. And one of the famous and well known rivers in South America is Amazon, which flows for hundreds of miles along the dense forests. And there were densely inhabited areas in Mexico, in Central America, along the coast and the plains. There were also scattered villages in forest areas. So the Mexico and the Central America also were densely populated, or it had a huge population. And there were forests, there were villages even inside dense forests. So one of the questions which come on from this topic is, what was the impact of European settlements on South America? This is a short answer question, and we could see that we have already seen that it had a disastrous or a very negative effect on the native people of America, because after exploration of these new continents, there was colonization, or the explorers colonized or kept this newly discovered continents under their control, which as a result of which the native people had to remain under the control of this explorers and the European colonizers for a long time. And in that case, the freedom and the free will of the native people were taken away, and they were subjected to a lot of violence and injustice during this period. So another question is, what were the new developments helping European navigation in the 15th century? So the factors which are leading to such navigation and explorations in the 15th century. So some Europeans, particularly the Spanish and the Portuguese, undertook voyages to unknown seas to discover trading routes which could help them acquire slaves and spices at a cheap rate. And they broke the narrow geographical bonds that had kept them in ignorance of much of the rest of the world. So this breaking of the boundaries or the geographical borders was a very important step towards exploring new places. And along with this, they persuaded the Pope to give them exclusive rights to rule over this newly discovered territories. So all of these factors worked as an incentive towards helping these nation states find out or explore new places and establish their control over this newly discovered territories. Now we come to indigenous people and cultures. So we see the first section, or the indigenous people we are looking at, is the Arawaks of the Caribbean and Brazil. So the Arawaks were people who were settled mainly in the Caribbean region and Brazil. So the Arawaks originally came from Venezuelan mainland. So Venezuela is a place within the Latin America, and the Arawaks had originally come from this region of Venezuela. And they were called Arawaks because of the language they spoke. So from the language which they spoke, they got this name Arawaks. And using Trinidad as a stepping stone, they spread up the Caribbean and beyond. So this Trinidad is another place within the American continent, and they used it as a place where they were established to spread towards the Caribbean region of the American continent. And the Arawaks people inhabited the lands that extend from Florida through the Caribbean to Bolivia, Paraguay, and northern Argentina. So, to all these places where this culture spread, starting from Florida through Caribbean to Bolivia and Paraguay and the northern Argentina. In all these places, we could see people belonging to this indigenous culture settled down. We see that Arawaks were very gentle people. The characteristics were they were very gentle people and they preferred negotiations and commercial exchange to war. So this shows that they were peace-loving people because they preferred negotiations or compromises in regard to war. So that shows that they were not interested in violence, but they preferred peaceful measures. And the society was characterized by happiness and friendliness. So, and it was highly organized. So it shows they were peace-loving people characterized by happiness and friendliness, and it was a very highly organized society. And each group consisted of a small kingdom, and the leader was called a cacique. So each group consisted of small kingdoms, and the leader was called by this term cacique. And we see they practiced polygamy, and most men had 2 to 3 wives. So polygamy is when men were allowed to marry more than once. And we see that most men had more than 2 or 3 wives, and there existed some degree of slavery. So although it's a peace-loving and friendly community, there was some practices of slavery which was there, and the Arawaks employed prisoners and other individuals in service, but they were not considered to be natural members of their communities. So whoever were caught, from outside community, were allowed to work and give their services to the community, but they were not considered as natural members but as outsiders by the Arawaks. And the men generally went naked, but women sometimes wore short skirts. So their dressing style was that men mostly went naked without much of adornments, and women sometimes wore short skirts. And men and women alike adorned their bodies with paints, shells, and other decorations. So although they had minimal clothing, we see that they adorned or beautified their body with paints, shells, and other decorations. And the staple diet or the food of Arawaks were meat or fish. And they also ate snakes, various kinds of rodents, that is animals like reptiles, bats, worms, birds, etc. So their dietary plan included all of these. And they were able to hunt ducks and turtles in the lakes and sea. The natives of the interior relied more on agriculture and hunting, using less fish in their diet. So ones who were near to the coastal areas or to the river or sea had more fish in their diet, but then who belonged to the interior plain regions, they preferred more of agriculture and hunting than relying on fish in their diet. And Arawaks raised crops in conucos. So this conucos or conucos was a system of agriculture they developed. And one of the Primary crops was cassava, a root crop. So this conicus was a special system of agriculture which was developed by Arawaks, and the primary crop which was grown in the system was cassava, which was a root crop. And they also grew corn, which is maize and squash, beans, peppers, sweet potatoes, yams, and peanuts. Cotton was grown and woven into fishing nets. So see, such advanced techniques were there where we see that cotton was used to wove fishing nets. And they also raised tobacco and enjoyed smoking very much. So along with all this production of different kinds of food, we see tobacco was also grown in these places, and people of the Arawak culture preferred and enjoyed smoking. And the Arawaks believed in many gods. So it's not one just single god, but then they believed in polytheism, that is having many gods, and the gods were called semis. So the name given to the gods is semis, and the people had special dress for religious ceremonies which included paints and feathers. And when you were involved in religious ceremonies and prayers, they were supposed to wear different types of clothes which also included paints and feathers. And the shamans, that is medicine men or priest, a person who had special powers to heal, are referred to as shamans. Heal diseases or people who are sick. And these shamans played an important part in their lives as healers. So when anybody fell ill or were critical, the people of this Arawak culture went to the shamans, hoping that he will be able to help them from dying. And they consulted their gods, that is semis, for advice and healing. Along with the shamans, they always depended on their gods, who they believed that had the power to save them or heal them. And this was done in public ceremonies with song and dance. So the prayers, as we see in today's communities also, that it was done in public places which included songs and dance. And the Arawaks had no large animals like horses, oxen, or mules to ride or use for work. Although it had other provisions, we see that there was an absence of large animals like horses, oxen, or mules for their work. But they had river and sea transportation. But they were dependent on this river and sea transportation, and they traveled rivers and seas using canoes. So these are like small boats which are called canoes was used. Small pointed boats which are called canoes was used for traveling and transporting things from one place to the other. And the Arawaks themselves were quite peaceful people. We already saw that they preferred negotiations over war. But they had to defend themselves from the Caliph who were Caribbeans. So this another section with whom they had conflict with was Caliphs who were Caribbeans. And the Arawaks had weapons which they used for their defense. So although they were peace-loving people, they had to keep some uh, equipments or weapons with them for their self-defense or protection. And they used the bow and arrow and had developed some poisons for their arrow tips. So for this purpose, they had bows and arrows, and some arrows. They had also some poison which could be used for the arrow tips to defend themselves if they were anywhere attacked by their enemies. And in the beginning, Arawaks collaborated with the Spanish in their search for gold. So initially when they came into a confrontation with the Spanish people, Arawaks felt that they must assist or give assistance to the Spanish people, and they collaborated or had friendly relation with Spanish and helped them search for gold. Because for the Spanish people, taking gold or digging of gold and finding out gold, so for Spanish people, search of gold and digging it out was very important. And this land was rich in gold and its resources. So Arawaks helped them locate places which was rich in gold. But when Spanish policy became brutal, they were forced to resist. But soon they understood that the Spanish or the Europeans were here to exploit them. So then they were left with no other choice but to protest and show their resistance. And this had disastrous consequences for Arawaks. So, but the result was it was disastrous, or it had negative impact on the Arawaks as a whole. Within only 25 years of contact with the Spanish, very little remained of Arawaks or their culture. And as a result, we see by 25 years of their contact with the Spanish culture, the Arawaks had come to a very poor state. They had declined and they were on the verge of extinction. So, like Arawaks, we see Tupinama in the east coast of South America, which were another set of people like the Arawaks, and they were called Tupinama. This also was an indigenous culture, and this section also belonged to the Native America and its culture. They lived in the villages in forests. So inside the forest, they had villages, and the Tupinama lived in those villages in the forest. And they could not clear the forest for cultivation because they did not know the use of iron. This is very important. In other cultures, the discovery of iron had taken place long back, which they used for clearing of forests and making it suitable for agriculture. But with the Tupinamas, they had not discovered iron, so they were to live in the villages which was there inside the forest. And they had, however, abundant supply of fruits, vegetables, and fish. So they did not have to depend upon agriculture. The most important thing is there was no need for them to depend on agriculture because they had abundant supply of fruits and vegetables and fish which helped them sustain. And the Europeans who came into contact with them envied their happy-go-lucky way of life, freedom, with no king, army, or church to interfere in their way of life. So when the Europeans came into confrontation or encounter with this Tupinamba, they were so jealous. I mean, the Europeans were so jealous of these people who were so having such an easy life with no king or an army or a church to interfere in their lives. They were very free and happily living their lives. And the Europeans were very surprised and envied to see their lives. So one question is write an essay on Arawaks. So this is a long question or an essay type question. So you'll have to bring in all the details of the Arawaks, which included where they came from and what their specific features were. We saw that they were gentle people who preferred negotiations over commercial exchanges, and they were happy and friendly people and highly organized, and the leader was called Cacique, and then they practiced polygamy, and there existed some degree of slavery, and Arawaks employed prisoners and other individuals in service but were not considered to be natural members of the communities, that is, who were the prisoners or who were forced to be part of it were not considered the members, the natural members of the community. And we also saw how their dressing style or pattern was and what its specific features included. And then the diet of the Arawaks, what kind of food they took, and what their agricultural pattern was. We saw that Arawaks raised crops in conifers, which was a system of agriculture, and the primary crop which they had was cassava, that is a root crop. Then we'll have to include the staple diet of Arawaks, which included meat or fish, and then the system of agriculture, that is very important, which was termed conifers, and the important crop of the system included cassava, which was a root crop, and then other varieties of crops or food materials, which was part of their diet, and then the raising of tobacco and how they enjoyed smoking very much, and their beliefs and customs, like they believed in many gods, and their gods were called semis, and the shamans, that is the healers, played an important role in the lives of people, and they also depended on river and sea transportation using canoes. And we also saw that although they were peace-loving people, they had conflicts with Caribs of Caribbeans, and for the purpose of self-defense, they had bows and arrows, and also developed some poisons for their arrow tips. And in the beginning of their collaboration with Spanish, they were friendly and helped the Spanish discover gold. But very soon they realized that the Spanish were here to exploit them. And as a self-defense, they started showing their resistance. But it turned out to be very disastrous for the Arawaks. And as a result, the culture itself got extinct in a very short period of their coming face to face with the Spaniards. So when the question on the essay or the life of Arawaks and the particular culture of Arawaks is asked, you'll have to include all these points. Now we come to the Central and South America and the state systems. So you know the American continent has the North America in the top, and then you have the Central American parts, and then towards the down side or towards the southern side you have Southern America. So that's how while you're learning this, while you're going through this chapter, you'll also have to have an atlas in front of you which will help you locate these places so that the whole geographical locations are clear to you. So now we see the Central and South America and the state systems there. We had already seen that there were two cultures which were dominant in America during this period. One is small subsistence based economies, and the examples we have already seen, like Arawaks is an example of the small subsistence based economy. And then second was large monarchical systems with a kingdom and other advanced administrative setup. So here we now look at the state systems, or how these kingdoms were organized and what kind of features it had. So unlike the Caribbean and Brazil, there were some highly organized states in Central America. So in Central America, we see highly organized states. And there was abundant supply of food grains, which provided the basis for urbanized civilizations of Aztecs, Mayas, and Incas. So this urbanized civilizations, that is, which had more urban or city centers or cities within it, were called urban, which was opposite to rural or village or agricultural based economy. And some of the examples of this large state systems were Aztecs, Mayas, and Incas. And the remains of the monumental buildings of their cities show their great skill of architecture and continue to mesmerize visitors even till today. So this remains of these large cities and the urban areas very clearly show the skills these people had in agriculture, the skills that these people had in architecture. So the monumental buildings of their cities are still an evidence of how advanced these state systems were, and it continued to mesmerize or surprise the visitors even till today. And in the 12th century, the Aztecs had migrated from north into the central valley of Mexico. So from the Northern American region, in the 12th century, the Aztecs had migrated to the central valley of Mexico, and they expanded their empire by defeating different tribes who were forced to pay tribute. So the Aztecs established themselves by defeating the tribal people or different tribes who were living there, and they were forced to pay a tribute or some kind of tax to the Aztecs. And the Aztec society was hierarchical, that is, it was not that everybody was equal, but it had an hierarchy or different stratas. And the nobility included those who were nobles by birth, priests, and others who had been awarded the rank. So the noble class or the rich upper section included nobles by birth. So by birth, if you are born into a very influential and affluent or rich family, you are termed a noble. And then the priests also had a noble status. And then others who were awarded ranks by the rulers were also considered noble category. And the hereditary nobility were a small minority who occupied the senior positions in the government, the army, and the priesthood. So the hereditary nobility, that is, who were born into very rich noble families, were given the responsibility or position within the administration, that is government, and the army and the priesthood. So they had some kind of a special treatment and preference. The nobles chose from among them a supreme leader who ruled until his death. So here the system of governance or government is such that the nobles chose among them a supreme leader. So one among them was chosen by the other nobles as a supreme leader, and he was then given the right to rule over its people until his death. And the king was regarded as the representative of sun on earth. So according to their belief of the Aztecs, the king was the representative of sun on earth. And the warriors, priests, nobles were most respected groups, but traders also enjoyed many privileges and often served the government as ambassadors and spies. So along with warriors, priests, and nobles, the traders were also given some kind of importance in this administrative unit or in this kingdom, because it was an urbanized economy with urban centers, and traders played a major role in sustaining this urban center, because they were the ones who looked after the affairs related to trade activities, which helped the cities flourish and sustain itself. And the talented artisans, physicians, and wise teachers were also respected. So along with the noble class, there was another section like the traders, artisans, physicians, and wise teachers who were also given respect and regard in this culture. And since land was limited, the Aztecs undertook reclamations. That is, reclamation referred to taking of wastelands or occupying wasteland and turning it into agriculturally rich regions. So cultivating wastelands so that it produces yield. That is what reclamation refers to. Cultivation done on land which was left fallow or which was considered a wasteland till then. So that is reclamation, and because of limited resources or land, the Aztecs undertook this process of reclamation, and they made chinampas, the artificial islands in Lake Mexico, by weaving huge reed mats and covering them with mud and plants. So because of this lack or scarcity of land, they also discovered a new method which was termed chinampas. So as per this system, artificial islands were created in Lake Mexico. So when a lake is flowing like this, you create an artificial island within this lake, and here they could cultivate and grow their crops. So an artificial island is created within this region, within the lake, so that cultivation happens. And it was to be done because there was serious limitation of land or scarcity of land resources in the Aztec kingdom. And this artificial island was created using reed mats, that is mats made of palm leaves, and covering them with mud and plants. So this was how this artificial island termed Chinampas was made. Between these exceptionally fertile islands, canals were constructed on which in 1325 was built the capital city of Tenochtitlan. So this capital city is very famous. The Aztecs had constructed it in 1325, and it was called Tenoch. It is pronounced as Tenochtitlan. And its palaces and pyramids rose dramatically out of the lake. So it also had palaces and pyramids which also was built on the lakes. And because of the Aztecs were frequently engaged in war, the most impressive temples were dedicated to the gods of war and the sun. So unlike the Arawak indigenous people, Aztecs were not that very peace-loving people. Instead, they involved themselves in war. We saw that when they came to the central Mexico or the Central Americas, they had defeated the different tribes over there, and they were collecting tribute or attacks from them. So we see, as they were involved in war and were interested in acquiring more land through war, they considered the god of war and sun as, they dedicated the temples to the god of wars and the suns. That shows how much importance they gave to war and expansion of the territory. And we see that the Aztec empire rested on rural base. Although it was an urban economy, it had its foundation on a rural base. People cultivated corn, beans, squash, pumpkins, manioc root, potatoes, and other crops. So these were the important crops grown in this kingdom. And land was owned not by individuals but by clans, which also organized public construction works. So most importantly, the land was not an individual property or a private property, but it was owned by clans, which is a section of people who had some kinship relations, that is blood relations with. Sometimes it must be like a same ancestor, or otherwise a group of people with some kind of kinship relations. And peasants, like European serfs, were attached to the lands owned by the nobility and cultivated them in exchange for the part of the harvest. So similar to the feudal system where the serfs were supposed to work on the land of the feudal lord, here too peasants were were supposed to work on the land of nobility, and they were given some share of the crop during the harvest. And the poor would sometimes sell their children as slaves. So slavery also existed in a form, and children were sold by their parents, but this was usually only for a limited period, and slaves could buy back their freedom. But it was not something which was there for all life, but there was a provision that slaves could reclaim or uh, get back their freedom. That was also allowed. And the Aztecs made sure that all children went to school. So see how advanced they are, that the Aztecs made sure that all of the children went to school. Children of the nobility attended Calmicac and were trained to become military and religious leaders. So nobility, we already saw, had preferential treatment like in any other place, and they were trained in schools which was called Calmicac, and they were trained to become military and religious leaders. And other common people and their children went to Tepochkali in the neighborhood, where they learned history, myths, religion, and ceremonial songs. So here the common students were trained in all this, and the children of the nobility were trained to become religious leaders and military leaders. And the boys received military training as well as training in agriculture and trades, and girls were trained in domestic skills. So gender division of labor is already there. Boys are trained in agriculture and military services, and the girls were trained to kind of look after the household chores. And in the early 16th century, the Aztec Empire was showing signs of strain. So by the 16th century, this very developed empire was declining. So the signs of decline could be seen. And this was largely to do with discontent among recently conquered people who were looking for opportunities to break free from central control. So one of the reasons for the decline was not that the Europeans were attacking, but whomever the Aztecs had invaded. So we see they were interested in war and invading people and their territories. So we see the newly conquered people or invaded people were just trying to free themselves from the central control of the Aztecs. So this was one of the reasons why there was signs of decline which could be seen among the Aztec people or in the Aztec Empire. Another important culture is Mayan culture or the Maya culture of Mexico, like the Aztecs, which developed remarkably. So the Mayans or the Mayas are very important, and they also developed remarkably between 11th and 14th centuries. So this is the time period in which they are also growing powerful. Like the Aztecs, we saw by 12th century they moved to the central Mexico region and established themselves as powerful empire. The Mayas are also doing the same. But in the 16th century, they had less political power than the Aztecs. So by 16th century, both are on the verge of a decline. And the Mayan economy was mainly agriculture. So here the base is agricultural for the Mayans too. And the main items of their food were maize, beans, potatoes, papaya, chili, and squash. So these were the staple food items grown there. And they performed many religious ceremonies on the occasion of planting, growing, and harvesting of crops. So these agricultural activities were considered very sacred, and religious ceremonies were performed during all these occasions. And efficient agricultural production generated surplus, that is extra crops and extra harvest, which helped the ruling classes, priests and chiefs invest in architecture and in the development of astronomy and mathematics. So this generation of surplus amount of food grains helped the ruling class, like the chieftains and the priests, to invest the resources in architecture and in the development of astronomy and mathematics. So they could now devote time and resources for development all these because of the surplus production. And the Mayas devised a pictographic form of writing that has only been partially deciphered, and they have left chronological records and inscriptions on clay tables. So clay tablets are still available, which has records of the Mayan civilization, and the notings or specific features are described in it, which was written by the people who had lived then. But interestingly, the pictographic form, that is, alphabets are more or less in the form of a picture. Each alphabet represents or is represented in a form of a picture. That is why it is called pictographic form. But it is only partially deciphered or decoded, and the full decipherment has not happened. But still we have clay tablets with inscriptions and chronological records which were maintained by the people of Mayan civilization, and it becomes an important record of this period.